Hi, Hunter Hastings here. At The Value Creators, our field is entrepreneurial business, which we define as the creation of new value for customers. New services, new products, new technologies, new applications, faster deliveries, new ways to deliver well-being that improves people's lives. Now, since this all takes place in the future, there can be no prediction. There can be no certainty. There's flow and evolution and emergence, but definitely no certainty, and therefore no planning. Can there be strategy? They teach you strategy at business school. They sometimes call it strategic planning. So really it's about predicting the future. And often it's putting that future in numbers and plans and spreadsheets. Is strategy really any use to business?
This is the Value Creators Podcast. Value creation is the sole purpose of any business and every business, and for all of us as entrepreneurs. Listen to great value creators as they share their successes, trials, and lessons learned. Join us as we explore how to think as value creators, how to act as value creators, and how to view business through the lens of value creation.
Our guest today is Chet Richards. He's a PhD in mathematics, a distinguished graduate of the War College, and a practitioner of lean production methods at major corporations like Lockheed Martin, as well as a strategic consultant to companies all over the globe. He has a different perspective on strategy. Chet, welcome to the Value Creators Podcast.
Hello, Hunter. Hi. Glad to meet you.
So our subject today, Chet, is strategy in business. You're a strategist from the Air War College, from your mathematics background, from your consulting background, your experience in lean manufacturing and lean methods and the Toyota production system and so on. Strategy as a tool for business success is what we're going to talk about. And I would make the case that's a bit of a flawed concept. We tend to look at which companies have been successful, and then we reverse engineer, well, this must have been the strategy that made them successful. But that's never going to be successful because strategy is about the future and you can't just reconstruct it from the past. And one of the things I was impressed in your book, Certain to Win, was a different perspective on strategy. And you say strategy is people. And we'll dig into that a little bit, but maybe you can start there. Tell us about your overall view of strategy and maybe some of the background thinking that got you to that point of view.
At least as far as business goes, war and business have really only one thing in common, and that is they involve groups of people working together in conditions of high uncertainty and various degrees of risk and danger. Obviously, war being much more dangerous than business, although people do get driven to early heart attacks and commit suicide. And yeah, it being groups of people working together under conditions of uncertainty. And furthermore, these conditions of uncertainty are deliberately caused, at least in part, by outside forces. In war, it's the opponent. In business, it's partly the competitors, partly the customer, and it's partly the environment, particularly the regulatory environment, the societal conditions that we have to work in. And all of these generate uncertainty. And the trick is you're trying to get your group of people to work together under these conditions, in some senses better than your competitors. And in that sense, war and business then, that's sort of what they have in common. And that's sort of where they diverge. Now, the diverging point, I think, is very interesting. And Boyd died before I had a chance to put it all together. But I said, it seemed to me that the essence of Boyd's whole method, at least in conflict, was to, and I'll try to say it kind of how he would say it, but stoke up the creativity and enthusiasm and initiative of everybody in the organization, throughout the organization, and harmonize that to accomplish the objectives or the purposes of the organization. So it's a two-step process. One is got to get everybody fired up. And the other step is, okay, now you have everybody fired up. How do you keep it from becoming herding cats? How do you get all this energy, this creativity and enthusiasm that you've now stoked up and get all that harmonized together so that you accomplish what it is you set out to accomplish? Now, in war, typically, this is the missions that come down from the level above you. In other words, you're given tasks, you're given missions to accomplish. And it's now, how do you get all the creativity and initiative throughout the organization to accomplish that? And it may be some very new member of your organization who also happened to be associated with gangs in downtown LA. And I'm indebted to Mike Wiley on this. It says, hey, look over there. We know how to do that. That's what we do in gang warfare. We do this, we do that. We fake them out. We kind of do this over here, and then when their attention's over there, we try to do something over there. And we kind of, as a situation develops, we're sort of trying to keep it all going along, keeping everybody going. And Mike said that was one of the things that got him on maneuver warfare, was to keep the sort of break the situation open and then keep it open while you're trying to accomplish what's going on. That's essentially maneuver warfare in a nutshell. And if you stop and think about it, that's thriving on chaos. Well, it makes sense if you can thrive on chaos. It's to your benefit to create chaos. And basically all of Boyd's stuff on war, it kind of gets those two sides going. The creating chaos side he called operating inside the OODA loop, which doesn't really apply that much to business, by the way. But then the harmonizing it are the moral forces, which is where I saw the parallels with Austrian economics. It's heavy on empathy. For example, the key concept inside Boyd's whole paradigm of how to accomplish things in an uncertain world is his OODA loop. And not the going around in circle version, but the kind that has that drawing near the end of the book that you saw with the big square in the middle that says orientation. And Boyd before defined orientation as a many-sided, implicit, cross-referencing process of projection, empathy, correlation, and rejection. In other words, he stuck that word empathy in very deliberately. He thought a long time about how to do that, about how to draw that OODA loop thing. We have some of his sketches that are in the Marine Corps Library that actually Mark uncovered in a visit to the Marine Corps Library, where he's going through various iterations of how to put the OODA loop sketch together. And it's really interesting that after several years of doing that, probably many years of thinking about it, that word empathy, appears as a key factor in orientation. And that's what I think distinguishes Boyd's idea of strategy, which can't be really distinguished from what the military calls command and control, what Boyd called leadership and appreciation. There's another word that kind of gets in there, of where you develop this feeling, this fingertip feeling, which you call Fingerspitzengefühl, for what's going on, both outside in the external world and what's going on within your group. In business, I guess the guy that usually gets given up is the model of this Fingerspitzengefühl for the marketplace was Steve Jobs. He had this almost mystical sense for what would sell. He didn't always get it right, but he got it right often enough that he was able to shape the market for at least consumer IT, and in ways that maybe only Elon Musk has managed. Yeah. Okay. And I mean, look at the iPod, just the same, Apple Watch, which of course came out long after he died. The iPad, the Macs that you and I are working on. He had this feeling for how the marketplace could be moved, and this idea of course, moving the market is an old idea. The idea of that the customer is not your R&D department. It's not the customer's job to develop new products. It's your job to develop them and put them out on the marketplace and offer them up to the customer.
Teaching them what they can want. So
yeah, very good description. I like that.
So a couple of questions here, Chet. You talked about stoking everybody up and then getting to the harmony part. In your book, you talk a lot about vision. I think this is a vision so attractive that it attracts the uncommitted and magnifies the spirit and strength of its adherents. It's a beacon. It's an uplifting idea.
Yeah, chart 143 of Patterns of Conflict, I think, thereabouts, very close to page 143. He's talking about grand strategy there. And chart 143. I've got to be careful of this. Boyd once said, if you get to where you've kind of memorized all this stuff, then the best thing to do is shred it, because otherwise it'll become dark. But what he's saying there is, okay, look, in conflict, there's that two sets of things: the creating chaos, and now you're creating chaos within the opponent, But then how do you get the people, the guys on our side then to take this initiative in ways that carries out your objective? And this, one of the tools that he comes up with is that noble vision. But I'd like to say one thing about it. He came out with this in the 80s, back when corporate vision and vision statements and all that were all the rage. And I told John, there's a risk in this that if you put this vision thing in, it's going to get subsumed in the vision statements, which I certainly share Deming's assessment of exhortations to the workplace. Post a vision statement on the wall, and of course, after about a week, it just becomes part of the wallpaper. And if it means anything at all, nobody notices anymore. So, but in this kind of thing here, what he's saying is, all right, one of the tools for harmonization, and there were several that he talked about. The two primary ones were, he used the German word Schwerpunkt, or focus and direction. In other words, what's the most important thing that we're trying to accomplish in all of this? And then everything else that you do supports that most important thing. And the other one is Auftragstaktik, which has had a little bit of a flurry of popularity, I think, thanks a lot to the work from Stephen Bungay in his Art of Action book. And that is, okay, now, once we know what it is we're trying to overall accomplish, what's my part? What do you want me to do now? Tell me, boss, what do you want me to accomplish? And you do that through Auftragstaktik. So you say during the Sherpa, right, this is our general concept. So in the military, you typically only have one in a general operation. In the Marine Corps, is a little more specific. They assign to the Schwerpunkt to a specific unit. And then all the other units then know to some degree what they have to do to support it. And then via Auftragstaktik, you can give specific missions to not only the Schwerpunkt unit, but to the other units in the organization. Mike Wiley used to talk about it that, for example, when you're trying to cross a river, and he said, the one thing that you never ever do is across the river at a bridge, because you just know what's going to be on the other side of the bridge. But what you want to do is have your opponents think that you're going to cross at the bridge. So one of the units has to have the mission of trying to make the other side think that you're going to cross at this ford or bridge or whatever, while the unit that you gave the Schwerpunkt to tries to figure out how I'm really going to get across. We're going to bring up mobile bridging equipment. Can we swim across it? Can we go across on logs? How am I going to get across the river here, the bridge, the creek, whatever it is? And then everybody else raises hell in some other part of the battlefield so that the bridge crossing by the Schwerpunkt unit can succeed. And then once they succeed and they start going across, that's going to attract the attention of the enemy. And at that point, then the other units, it may now become appropriate for the other unit then to charge across the bridge, eliminate the few people that are left there to help. But you leave that kind of decision up to the person on that side to keep supporting the main goal. So Schwerpunkt, Auftragstaktik. So two of the things. So you can see the Schwerpunkt kind of has some of the flavor of a vision in it, but it's a very actionable vision. You're going to accomplish this mission by this time with these forces and the other support that I can give you. And once you accept that mission, then via the Auftragstaktik thing, it's yours. I've got other things to worry about. I got to go on and worry about other things. So I'm assuming that if I don't hear back from you, that there's a problem, that you're accomplishing your mission. And that's the basic concept in the military that I've tried to adapt to business. I think the big difference with business is that you can have more than one Schwerpunkt as long as they don't trade off. And for example, look at Toyota. Before Toyota, quality and your cost position traded off. To improve your quality, you had to inspect more, you had to use higher quality components, you had to fix more. And so your cost position got worse. Your actual cost went up, of course, but your cost position got worse. Also, the length of time that it took to do it spread out, because it takes time, more time to inspect, more time to fix things. And so what happened was that your cost and your span time deteriorated as your quality went up. And it turns out that to improve any one of those, the other two were going to get bad. What Toyota figured out was a way to improve all three at the same time. They broke the trade-off between cost and quality, but they did it not by focusing on cost and not by focusing on quality per se, but by focusing on the third element, by focusing on time. Very Oriental, I think, look at the problem. Something almost mystical about time in that. But what they found was by doing things that pulled time out of the system, they called it, of course, reducing waste. By doing things that pull time out of the system, cost and quality improved simultaneously. Because the only way to do it is to not be, for example, simple thing, don't make so many mistakes. If you don't make as many mistakes, then you don't waste time correcting them. And so the trick is don't make them in the first place. All right, well, how do you do that then? And that's, of course, the mechanics of the Toyota. And Toyota actually says that very explicitly. They used to, and they still do, give a big, thick manual on the Toyota production system to their new suppliers here in the United States. And it was issued by the Toyota Supplier Support System up in Lexington, Kentucky. And the very first statement, it says the essence of the Toyota production system is to reduce the time between when a customer orders a car and when they receive it. You say, well, let's just build lots of inventory then. And when the customer orders it, we'll just give them this car. Okay, how many different permutations of Toyota vehicles are there? And how many of them are you going to make of each kind? And then at the end of the year, when you have all these ones that didn't sell, then what do you do? So you really quickly see building inventory doesn't work. There's got to be another one. Of course, the Toyota production system is anathema on work in process inventory. And for all the reasons you're very familiar with. So you see, all this stuff starts fitting together, and it starts fitting into Boyd's thing of once people understand the Toyota production system, then they're not only free to, they're basically required to use their initiative to improve the system. If you have an idea of doing it better, whether you're the CEO or whether you just joined the production line, it's your duty to pony up that idea, to come up with that idea. Now, they may or may not accept it. There are rigid criteria for accepting it, but they'll think about it. And that's the same idea.
That's a theme of your book that I picked up a little bit, Chet, which is time. It's the centrality of time, the importance of time, the focus of time. So say a little bit more about that outside of Toyota, I mean, just in general for people. How should business people think about time and how to make it central, how to use it better?
Boy, that's a really, really, really good question. And I can't give you a formula on that other just to point out the obvious, that time is the one, non-renewable resource. I mean, you think you can renew it, but you're really not. You're just chewing more and more of it up. Go back to Boyd for a second. The way Boyd basically used time was to disorient his opponent. He changed the environment, changed the situation more rapidly than the other side could comprehend. In other words, not more rapidly than the other side could respond, but more rapidly than the other side could figure out what was going on. And then while the other side thought he had to figure out, you're doing something else. As Boyd said, you're handing him dilemmas faster than he can solve them. And what that did was it basically caused his problem solving, his decision-making ability, and eventually the cohesion of the other organizations to break down. If it's an organization that splits into what he called a many non-cooperative centers of gravity, squabbling among each other, and this impedes the visual response. It pumps up what he called the entropy within the organization. Now the organization is using its energy to fight among itself rather than to engage and defeat the opponent. Okay, translate that over to business. It's completely different. And it took me a long time to figure it out. And I didn't actually figure it out. What I figured out was that some guy who had written an obscure paper, and I think it was the Sloan Management Review, figured it out. And you're probably familiar with the guy, Alan Ward, the late Alan Ward, much better manufacturing engineer than he was a pilot, as it turns out. But he, in his very famous paper, the second Toyota paradox, broke the code, because the subtitle of that paper was "How Delaying Decisions Can Build Better Cars Faster." And I said, "Wow, that is how you deal with time in business. At least that's one very good way to deal with time in business." And if you look at, for example, look at Apple. And look, when they introduced the iPod back in 2001, I think it was, just before 9/11. I think it was October 2001 when it came out, or just after 9/11. Anyway, it was just about that same time. And there were solid state MP3 players out at the time. I had one called the Rio Cali, and they were a lot cheaper than an iPod. And with some work, you could actually download music to the thing and get it to play. I wanted something that played when I went and run. But it was better to do. I think it held like 30 songs, 40 songs, something like that at one time, because it had a rudimentary solid state memory. And it wasn't very well made. After a while, strange thing happened. The headphones that you plugged into it, and it was a plug-in device, quit working. And they just quit. You jiggle around, they work a little bit, and then they quit. And it was just the way that it was. And then Apple came out with this thing. I think it sold for like, what was it, $499 or something like that. Enormous amount of money at the time for the Model 1. But it held 1,000 songs. And the quality of it was incredible. And it downloaded virtually. I mean, at the time, it was so easy to download compared to anything else. Now, of course, it's virtually automatic through the cloud. But even then, you basically just plugged the thing into your computer and said sync, and that's all you wanted to do. That's all you had to do. All 1,000 songs came over me. Wow, this is cool. Problem jogging with it because it had a hard drive, and when it was trying to load from the hard drive over to the solid state drive, if you were running, it would lock up. But forget about that. It was a magnificent thing. Plus, it would back up. You could use it as a backup hard disk for your computer. So I said, God, this is really, really cool. All right. That was the Model 1. That was October 2001. They did a little fiddling with it, but the next big update didn't come out till like a year later. And the next big update to that came out about a year after that. You can go onto Wikipedia and see all these updates. So I got to thinking, this is fascinating. Apple doesn't see any payoff in trying to shorten that cycle, the update cycle. And I said, this does a couple of things. It allows them to use that set-based methodology that Ward and his associates had come up with. Whether they actually use that specific one or not, I don't know. But what it meant is they knew they had a year to turn out the most, to use Steve Jobs' expression, insanely great new iPod that they could. And that was their Schwerpunkt. That was their focus. That was their vision. On October or whatever it was, 2003, we're going to come out with something that just blows the competition so far out of the water. So even if they haven't come up, and you remember Microsoft with the Zune, Z-U-N-E, I never knew anybody that actually owned one, but they did come out. And like somebody once came out and said, by the time that Microsoft has equaled what the iPod can do, Steve Jobs and Apple have already come out with a new one. I said, that's more in a nutshell. That's operating inside the OODA loop, but not doing it more quickly, but that's using the time now orthogonally, you might think about it, rather than compressing the time from this model to the next model. This time is fixed, and now you're using this time this way to come up and explore more options and come up and do more trade-offs, do more pushing the R&D to come up with bigger solid state drives or bigger hard drives, or getting the software, the iTunes software, which at the time was really cool, but let's face it, it still is kind of a mess. But now we have streaming, so who really cares?
Yeah, I was going to say that's changed a little bit now. Elon Musk talks about making continuous change. You're changing, changing the car every minute, every second.
Yeah, the only problem is every now and then you're going to brick the car in your driveway, but there is that, as has happened to Rivian. I have a Volvo that has over-the-air updates, and I tell you, every time I install it, I fingers crossed and take a deep breath. At least once it did crash on me, but the Volvo service was able to get it back going again. So that's what about time. It's very important. Both Apple and War are using time, but they're using it in completely different ways. So my message to your viewers is: don't try to do what Boyd did, and don't even try to do what Steve Jobs and Alan Ward did, but develop a deep understanding of the role of time in your business. So what would happen, for example, Samsung, then jumped into the business. Microsoft disappeared. Samsung and Google came out with their Android phones, and I guess in terms of total numbers, outsell the iPhone. In terms of profitability, it's probably not even close. But be that as it may, Samsung decided they were going to try to play the time game by doing more frequent updates. And what would happen is Samsung, if you remember, they would introduce a new Android, a new Galaxy, or whatever they call the phones. They would introduce one several weeks before Apple came out with the with the iPhone. Virtually nobody bought it. Everybody said, "That's nice. Let's wait and see what new iPhones are coming out in 2 weeks. Let's see what they got." And they were able to use this time dimension not only to do more intense R&D over a fixed length of time, but also as a sales and marketing ploy to make that big event, which it still is, of course, the September and May, I guess.
Yeah, Chet, how can we help companies with this reorientation? You called it many-sided, implicit cross-referencing, many variables. many dimensions, many analyses, syntheses. Can we learn that? Can we teach it? Can we get better at it?
Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. I was going to say, but I have no idea how, but actually I do. There are a couple of things, a couple of ideas that Boyd gave for conflict that I think apply to business. One of the downsides maybe to business, and I'm saying this with tongue firmly in cheek, is that, and how can I say this so it doesn't sound really stupid? War is very Darwinian in a sense, and you can see this happening, for example, in the Russian-Ukrainian war today. Forces that don't learn from experience get eliminated. If you haven't figured out what all these drones overhead can do to you, then very quickly one of them is going to land on you. So all right, so for example, how do we deal with the drone threat? So they're trying stuff all the time. And some of it is technical. Some of it is doctrinal. What time of day you move, how you move, and some of it is the people side of it. How they move on the battlefield, how they try to detect these drones, how do they tell the other people in their unit that there are enemy drones in the area, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The same thing doesn't tend to happen quite as well in business, because I believe part of it is that the penalties for failure are not quite as drastic as perhaps they are in. And you can be really bad and still survive in business for a long time. And this is another thing Boyd, the great Boydism is. He said, with all of this stuff, you don't have to be perfect. In fact, you can be really bad so long as everybody else is worse. I'm not sure that totally applies to business, because there's always the possibility of new competitors, entrepreneurs popping up into the space. And so what happens in I think in business a lot of times is you get the Maginot Line mentality. You've been so successful in one line of business that your organization basically gets structured to protect that line of business. And I've seen that in companies I work with. We can't do that. It would be a threat to XYZ. And I say, excuse me, if it's a threat to XYZ, then shouldn't we be the ones doing it? For some reason that never really caught on. And then I realized these people spent their entire careers, many times, coming up through the ranks in that particular line of business. And that's and so intellectually they'll agree with you that, yeah, we should be doing this, that, but emotionally they're attached to what they're doing. How do you overcome that? There may not be a way for many businesses, simply because the people at the very top, and let's be honest with it, people at the very top got there through this, and they're going to stay there because there's really no downside to them. They can retire, they can take, they can move on to board of directorships of another company, they can take their golden parachutes. C-levels have become so lucrative that I sometimes wonder myself, why the hell do you stay there? Why don't you just take your golden parachute and leave now? Become an entrepreneur, or you go lie on the beach. Why put yourself up to this? It's a really difficult problem because your orientation gets locked by forces within the organization. And I see this time and time again. In the military, that tends to happen also, but these guys tend to get eliminated, or their units. And sometimes it's very bad. Attrition can be very high. A lot of people get hurt and a lot of people get killed before you get rid of that Colonel Blimpo layer, that's at the top. I'm not going to talk about whether that's applied to the U.S. military or not. That's not my.
One of the ways that people talk about in business is to think of your firm as a portfolio of experiments. So you've got the old established stuff running, but you always keep a high activity and experiments, and some experiments will work, and then they can be allocated more resources, and over time you can make the shift. Does that appeal?
That's a great idea if you can do it. But Lockheed actually pioneered that. Sometimes it's called the Skunk Works approach. Of course, what happened with Lockheed is that after a while, only the Skunk Works was viable. It was the Skunk Works that gave you the F-22 and F-35, for example, the two new fighters that are still in production. They bought the F-16 from General Dynamics. All of the stuff that mainline Lockheed had done, first the commercial stuff, the L-1011 went away, and then finally the transport business got down to where it's just cranking out C-130s, airplane that first flew in 1953, if I remember correctly. It's been updated over the years and all that, but it's still basically a 4-engine turboprop sitting there, flying along, does its job very nicely. But the organization that did it is, I don't want to say anything bad about life, but they're basically brain dead. There's no reason. It would cost so much money to replace that capability with a new airplane that nobody's doing it. The Europeans tried with the Airbus A400M, but it's so expensive that very few of them sold around the world compared to the C-130s that number in the thousands. It's a very good airplane. Nothing wrong with the A400M. It's just way too expensive for most countries to afford. And the same with the C-17, which is an all-jet airplane. Again, it's flown. It does very good airplane. It does its job quite well. Just way too expensive. So what happened was essentially the part of Lockheed that was the main line, Lockheed essentially just died. Just that one line of business keeps cranking on. And it gets updated. They put new engines on it back 25 years ago, called it C-130J. And it's very good airplane, but that's, it's not the kind of organization that you thought we would survive out in the commercial marketplace where, new entrants can come in all of the time. And it's enormously expensive starting a new airplane company. So, other than a few niches, nobody does it.
But then there's the other side of Lockheed, right? They have the Skunk Works planes, the fighters that.
Right, but remember, they're basically a single customer. The F-22 was only sold to the U.S. government. The F-35 initially sold to the U.S. government, but then it was an international program from the outset. But it's deliberately designed not to be, to have all the capabilities of the F-22, and so that's fine. They work their one customer extremely, extremely well. I'll give them credit for that. But it's not the kind of thing that most of your listeners are going to have the luxury of doing. You're having a single customer that supports your organization, for decades at a time. Most of them have to get out and compete in the marketplace for customers and basically do it every day. So the idea of having the Skunk Works out there, I think, is a good idea in principle. Making it work, as you probably know, extremely difficult because of both the resistance from the mainline companies, plus the fact, let's face it, most good ideas never produce commercially viable product. It's almost legendary what small percentage of startups, make it 5 years. I think we said I taught the family business program for a while, and we said, well, if you're lucky, it's maybe 5 to 7%. And it doesn't make any difference whether it's a family business or not. Family businesses have some tremendous advantages in the fact that they all know each other, cohesion. They're not focused on the next quarter bottom line and a bunch of faceless stockholders who are basically just speculators and will dump them in a second if they think they can get a higher return somewhere else. Or venture capitalists that are going to come in and take it over. They don't have to worry about any of that stuff. But still, their survival rate is very low because their internal owners want the money. Basically, they want higher and higher and higher interest. So you're cranking out more and more and more cash, and this makes it very difficult for them to invest enough in these little mini skunk works to actually come out with viable products. But it's a good idea in theory.
Okay. One of the ideas that comes up is in chaos theory, it's called explore and exploit. You're always exploring, and then if you find something that works, you do the linear job. Another word for that is ambidexterousness. So a company like Google can be constantly trying out new things, launching new businesses, but it also has its regular everyday search business, which it executes with excellence. So you're ambidextrous.
It's become synonymous with the word. I'll Google it.
Yeah.
You never heard anybody say, I'll Bing it. Even though Bing is a perfectly good search engine, there's nothing wrong with it at all. That's an interesting question. Now, here's the deal with all of this stuff. And by the way, that term, the military has that exact term. They call it a reconnaissance pull, where you're essentially exploring and reinforcing the ones that work. In fact, because of the chaos of the battlefield and the fact that the opponent, the enemy in the military, is coming at you too, it's much more difficult to do than it sounds like. Well, we'll just send a bunch of stuff out, and then whichever one's punched through, we'll reinforce them. And as Mike Raleigh pointed out, most likely right into an ambush or what the Russians call a fire sack, as what's happened to the Ukrainians in their great counteroffensive of last summer. But in theory, that's basically what you do. Now, the key to all of this, and going back to orientation, and Boyd tried to hammer this home so many ways, you've got to remain an open system. Otherwise, the entropy within the system, which is the amount of energy within the system that's not being turned into useful activity. It's basically what we might call bureaucratic friction, bureaucratic warfare, inner bureaucratic fighting for resources, fighting for the attention of the boss, and all of that consumes more and more and more of the organization. So that so you have fewer and fewer successful ideas that actually do hit the marketplace. So the trick is how do you stay an open system? And it turns out that's where I think Steve Jobs did us both a big service and a big disservice. He did us a big service in that if you look at his background, he wasn't an IT major in college, as we all know. In fact, this famous thing about him taking the course in calligraphy, very, very instructive. And then his interest in Zen, which is kind of brushed aside by a lot of people, but I think it was really fundamental to what he did later on, which is why I think I would recommend to your readers, if they haven't already, that they pick up a copy of Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Shinryu Suzuki, not DT Suzuki. This is Shinryu Suzuki, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. It turns out that Shinryu knew Steve Jobs and didn't like him because it was in the early days. Jobs came across as something of a know-it-all, and Zen is all about orientation, which is why it merges into Boyd's philosophy so well. Now, as I said in my book, there's no sign that Boyd ever actually practiced in any way that we would recognize of Zen or any other form of Oriental religion, Oriental practice. But he read a lot about it, and he read a lot of the Japanese samurai stuff, not just Miyamoto Musashi, but basically everything he could get his hands on from that period that had been translated into English. And he was seeing the parallels between that stuff and what Toyota was doing. So he was beginning to put a lot of this stuff together when he died. But the focus on orientation is key, because what corrupts orientation is an inward focus. When you don't get sufficiently accurate interaction with the environment. All right. So the question is, well, why don't you do that? Well, consider the average company. It's a bureaucratic hierarchy. Your focus is on moving up the next layer in the bureaucracy. To do that, you may have to meet sales and marketing goals and all that out in the external world. That's quite true. But your real focus is on moving up. And it gets worse the higher up you go. It's the same thing in the military. If you're a 3-star general now, you think, wow, I've done so good. It's incredible. I've got 3 stars. I'm a lieutenant general, and I look around and I can command a corps, which is 100,000 people, in the Army. That's not what they think about. All they can think about is, how am I going to get that 4th star? That's really what consumes there, particularly in the peacetime military. I'm being a little bit unfair here, but I don't really think a whole lot, because you spent 30 years rising up through the hierarchy. That's really where your focus is. So the question is, how do you switch that around, and how do you then get an external focus? Very difficult. I think, again, it starts right at the very top with the CEO. The question is, does the CEO really want an external focus? Does he really want to be told that he's wrong 95% of the time, so that the 5% of the time he's right, they make big bucks for the company? Does he really want to stay paranoid? Because paranoia, sounds good. Only the paranoid survive, of course, and I think that's a very correct statement. But also, paranoia is very uncomfortable. It's considered a form of a mental disorder in me if it gets out of hand. What I think, unfortunately, most people, when they rise up through the hierarchy in a big company, what they really want is, they finally made it to the corner office. They want to be treated like they are the owner of the corner office. They want minions around them. They want to be told, and they want to be told how great they are. They want the vice presidents to kind of pretend to order a debate. When you make a decision, they want them to salute and go and carry out your instructions, or at least look like they're carrying out your instructions. They want to be treated like corporate CEOs, which is to live like how they imagine 4-star generals live. Oddly enough, 4-star generals want to be treated as they imagine corporate CEOs live. So there is some, of course, back and forth. A lot of 4-stars go on to serve, and very well, as boards of directors. But so the question is, how do you get that external focus? And I think it's very dependent on the individual. If you don't demand the external focus, it's enough to say, well, gee, only the bad news will do you any good. Well, are you rewarding the people who bring you bad news? Would somebody coming in from the outside agree that you're rewarding the bearers of bad news? Would other people in the organization say that you are, or would they say you're only paying lip service and what you're really doing is you're rewarding your sycophants because they make you comfortable? And so it's extremely difficult to maintain an external focus over a long period of time, but it starts with the need to make that one of your schwerpunkts. One of your guiding visions is the good stuff is happening outside. And that's Deming. Deming said exactly the same thing. His system of profound knowledge starts out with the importance of an external focus. But until you put mechanisms in place to actually make it happen, and outsiders particularly, and other people within your organization can see that is what you're actually doing. It's the old thing about don't tell me what you believe. Let me look at your checkbook back then. Now it's online. Let me see where you're spending your money, and I'll tell you what you believe. Yeah, that's the key thing. What are you actually doing to maintain an external focus? And then what mechanisms do you have in your company to act on that when you see the need to act? And then all the rest of this stuff, the harmonizing of orientation and all that, are tools to allow you to do that. Toyota Production System has that with their flow down with it. Forget the Japanese for it right now, but it's that idea of the Auftragtaktik all over again. Once you get this, the stuff flows down, and then the actions flow up. So it's not just bottoms up and top down. It's both at the same time, harmonized to work together.
So is that culture? Chet, you use that word in your book, culture, as opposed to organization.
Oh, absolutely. Sure. Culture, strategy, the same thing. I mean, strategy without culture is probably some very poorly written science fiction or fantasy. Probably not a lot of science. I read a fair amount of science fiction and fantasy, and there's a lot of really good writers out there. You wish these people would put their creativity to being, entrepreneurs and make an incredible amount of money. But there's also a lot of dross and dreck out there too, unfortunately.
We'll wrap it up at culture, but can I summarize that as developing that external focus and then acting on it, making sure that we act on the external focus? Is that?
Yeah, and what are you actually doing to make what you just said happen? And would an outsider, on the one hand, and members and other members of your organization, when they're speaking to you, where they know that this is not going to get back up the ladder, would they agree? I've seen so many companies I work for where the guy on top is thundering, and while I'm doing this, we're doing that. And, we're all looking at each other and rolling our eyes. Nothing has really changed. There was one guy that stood up and said, and my vice presidents are all on board with this new initiative. And we all said, yeah, because the ones that aren't are no longer with us. They went ahead and retired. And in fact, nothing changed. We used to have a saying at this company. We talked about these improvement programs, cost improvement programs, and quality improvement. We said, if you were lucky, your cost improvement program didn't raise your cost by any more than the cost of the staff to run the improvement program. So what are you actually doing to make it happen? Same in the military. All right, we're going to take this hill of it. What are your actual plans? How are you actually going to make that happen? What are you actually going to do? How are you going to find? So you have these, you say, well, we're going to go out, we're going to explore all these different openings. Okay, well, how's it going to work? You say, well, they're going to come back to me with opportunities. And then what? You're going to use your omniscient power to decide which one of these is going to succeed in the marketplace? Come on, give me a break.
So final question, you called your book Certain to Win. So it sound like we can ever be certain to win. Why did you choose?
We are certain to win. It's a quote from Sun Tzu, as you may have known. Actually, it's the first chapter of Sun Tzu. And I believe it's the Griffith translation. There are two main translations people use. Samuel B. Griffith from the early, when did he come out? Early 70s, 80s. Anyway, and then the Cleary translation, must have been the 60s, actually, 63, I think, the Griffith translation. He was a Marine Corps Brigadier General, did his PhD in Oxford, and wrote the Sun Tzu thing from his dissertation. And then Thomas Cleary, who is a Harvard-trained linguist, Japanese scholar, historian. And anyway, but I think it was the Griffith, and because what Sun Tzu is saying is, look, and he says it three different ways, and which probably suggests that there's three different authors, because, well, I think we all pretty much agree now. There may have been a guy named Sun Tzu, but all that means is master son being a man, proper name. And this is probably what we have are sort of crib sheets, notes The oldest one we have dates from before the turn of the 0th century, whatever, written on bamboo, the lingi bamboo, very similar to what we have today. But having said all that, he said, all right, there are these things you have to consider. The very first one, he calls us which leader has the way, the Tao. And the commentary says this means harmony, within the organization. Some people say harmony between the functioning of the organization and the external world, straight out of Boyd. And then he lists, the other things. By the way, none of the things that Sun Tzu lists, and there's 5 in one place and 2 places, actually 7 in another, none of them are how many forces you have and what's your level of technology. In fact, he says, even if you have a lot more forces than your enemy, how can this help you win? Because it's just as likely that it'll become cumbersome and they won't work together smoothly and harmoniously. But anyway, Sun Tzu says, so you got these factors, and he says, and the trick is to compare yourself along these 5 or 7, however you look at it, factors, with that of the other side. And by doing this, he said, you can decide who's going to win. If that's the case, if that's really true, then it stands to reason that the general who is looking at these factors says, okay, I'm a little bit behind, so I have 2 choices. I can either not fight, or I can improve over here to where I'm better, and then I can fight. And Sun Tzu says, if you got a general that can do that, he'll be certain to win. Hire him. If you have a general that skips on that, or tries to do something else, at some point he's going to lose because he's not concentrating. He's not pumping up himself on the 5 most important things. So at some point, one of those is going to trip him up and he's going to lose. But if you got a general that's constantly thinking about how am I going to improve myself on these 5 things, vis-a-vis the other, everything is relative in all of these, vis-a-vis the competitors and the opponents, he's certain to win. Hire him. So that's where it comes from, that notion of certain to win from Sun Tzu. But it's the same basic idea. You keep working on the fundamentals, keep stoking up the initiative and creativity throughout the organization, harmonizing it now. And that's hard because, once you start micromanaging, you kill both of those down in the lower level. Harmonizing those so that you got this laser beam now that you can now direct out and make things happen, you're certain to win. I can't tell you how. It may be one of those little things that somebody comes up with, like the Post-it notes or something. You go, wow, hey, that's pretty cool, And a few years later, maybe your organization is supporting your whole organization now. So anyway, that would sort of be my advice. I think I've rambled on a lot here, but hopefully there'll be some ideas that your listeners here can come up with and run with.
Chet, thank you very much. There's a lot to think about. As you said, we'll try and organize it. We try to produce what we call a knowledge capsule from all this. So I'll try and do that. We'll run it by you.
Okay. If you need to get back in touch again to clarify anything, don't hesitate.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much, Chet. This has been wonderful.
Thanks, Hunter. Good to meet you, and best of luck.
Thank you.
This has been another episode of the Value Creators Podcast. Thanks for listening. You can visit thevaluecreators.com for links and resources related to this episode. And check out hunterhastings.com for more content on entrepreneurial business management based on value creation principles.